Chapter 5, Lesson 7, Coordinate Reflections. Content target. Students will understand that you can find reflections on a coordinate grid. Our language target. Students will show their understanding of a coordinate plane by plotting coordinates on a graph and reflections of a point on a grid with a partner. So the first thing we need to do is we have to understand where to find a point at, or a coordinate. So here we're going to graph point M at -3, 5. So we're going to start at 0, or that origin is what it's called. And here's my x value, here's my y. X values go left to right. Y values are going to go up and down. So when I look at my coordinates, -3, 5, I know -3 is going to go left or right, and 5 is going to be either up or down, depending on if it's positive or negative. So I'm going to start here at 0, and I'm going to go to -3. So I start at 0, I go over here to the left to -3. Then I want to go up to 5. 5 is positive, so I have to go all the way up here to 5, put a dot, and put the letter M. That's how you find a point. You don't have to put the lines on there. You can just kind of draw it with your finger. That's okay too. So again, let's graph and label each point on a coordinate plane. So P is -2, 4. If I start at 0, I go to -2 on the x value first. Remember, x is first and then y. So I go over to -2. Then I'm going to 4. 4 is up, so I go up, and here's point P. B is Q at 0, -4. So I start at 0. I go 0 left or right, so I don't move. If it's 0, I'm right here on this origin. And then my next number is -4. So then I go down to -4, and I put a point. And I put the letter Q next to it. So letter C, R is -1/2, -2 1/2. So I start here at 0. I go negatives are this way, positives are this way, Y's positives are up, negatives are down. So I start at 0, I go over 1/2, that's halfway between 1 and 0. And then I need to go down 2 1/2. So I go down 1, 2 1/2. So it's going to be right in the middle of that square there. And I'm going to label it R. The last one is S is S is 4 1/2, 1. So I start at 0. I go to 4 1/2, and Y tells me I go to 1, which is up 1. And I put my letter S there for that value. Reflections. You can graph points that are reflected across the X and Y axis. Remember that the points reflected across the X axis will have the same X coordinate, and their Y coordinates will be the opposites. Points reflected across the Y axis will have the same Y coordinate, and their X coordinates will be opposite. So again, we talked about these yesterday, and we want to make sure we have these written down in our notebook so we can come back to it. If it says to reflect across the x-axis, x stays the same, y changes to its opposite. If we reflect across the y-axis, y coordinate stays the same, and the x changes to its opposite. So here we have graph A, 2, -4, then graph its reflection across the x-axis. So across the x-axis, so 2, -4. So we're going to graph that first. We start at 0, start at the origin. I go over to 2, that's my x. And -4 is down below, so I have to go down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. put my point, there is A. But I also want to graph its reflection. So when we talk about reflection, across the x-axis, x stays the same. And what happens to the y? We find its opposite. The opposite of -4 is 4. So I graph that as well. I start at 0, I go over 2, and up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's A1 because that's the opposite. Let's graph letter B at -1.5, 3. Then graph its reflection across the y-axis. So here we're going across the y-axis this time. So I have -1.5 and 3. So to graph this, I start at 0. I go over to 1.5, and I go up 3. 1, 2, 3. That's letter B. So now I want to find the reflection across the y-axis. Here's x, here's y. When we reflect across the y-axis, y stays the same, so 3. X changes to its opposite. The opposite of a -1.5 is 1.5. So I start here. I go to 1.5 to the right. Here's 1.5 and up 3. And that's B with a 1. Notice on how they're the same line because we're talking about y. They have to be across the y-axis from each other. So letter E says to graph with -1, 5 and graph it across the x-axis. So if I have a negative -1, 5, here's my x, here's my y. I'm going to go to -1, up 5. So here's point C. To graph across the x-axis, and this one, x stays the same, which is -1, and y changes to its opposite. Opposite of 5 is -5. So I go over to -1, down to -5, and that's C1. Graph D, 2 and 3.5, and graph its reflection across the y-axis. So here we're going to go graph letter D. So we start at 0, we go over 2, and up 3.5. Sorry, that's not quite a half. We'll get right on that and fix it. So there's D. Now I've got to reflect that across the y-axis. So y stays the same. And x changes to its opposite. The opposite of 2 is -2. Notice the same number, we just put the sign in front. So I start at 0, I go over to 2, up 3.5, and there's D1.